good evening, afternoon, depending on where you're tuning in from. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I am the Senior Public Programs Producer at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's discussion of Jewish life in medieval Spain. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you are able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our current exhibitions, including Courage to Act, Rescue in Denmark, which is the museum's first exhibition for visitors ages 9 and up. And you can learn more about that and get tickets on our website. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off are posted in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. So not the chat, the Q&A. So today we are so honored to be joined by Jonathan Ray. Jonathan is the Samuel Eig Professor of Jewish Studies in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University. He holds a BA from Tufts University in History and Religion and a PhD in Jewish History from the Jewish Theological Seminary. He specializes in medieval and early modern history, focusing on Sephardic Jews, and is the author of several books and articles on Jewish history and culture. So you can purchase Jewish Life in Medieval Spain at the link in the chat. So thank you so much for joining us. And now I'm going to hand things over to Jonathan.
Thank you very much. And thank you, all of you, for Zooming in with us this evening. It's a pleasure to be with you, even if it's just virtually, and to be part of this great series. So considering the current state of things in the world, I hope it will be helpful to retreat into the past for a bit, but also to get some perspective on Jewish life and the Jews' relationship with their neighbors. So why write a book on the Jewish life in the Middle Ages? I suppose we can start there. Well, for those who are not familiar with the subject, the Jews of medieval Spain really do represent one of the most fabled societies in all of Jewish history. Already in the Middle Ages, while there were still Jews in Spain, Jewish writers began to extol the virtues of the Jews of Iberia, or of Sepharad, as it's known in Hebrew. It presented this group as living in a land of poets and philosophers, wealthy spice merchants, and pious rabbis. And so for as long as there have been Jews in medieval Spain, we have a legend that grows up with them. The reputation of the society was so great that even after the summary expulsion of all Jews from Spain in 1492, the legend of a golden age of Jewish culture continued to grow. For centuries, nostalgia, pride, hope, and guilt have sustained and embellished the memory of medieval Sephardim among Jews and non-Jews alike. And to this day, it is held up as a model of the best and perhaps at times the worst of Jewish history. So in many ways, it's a great subject to talk about if you're interested in any aspect of Jewish history. It's seen by many as the cornerstone of Jewish history as we have come to know it. But the reality of daily life for medieval Jews was often far different and perhaps far more familiar to us than these legendary accounts of Spain would have us believe. So tonight, I want to highlight some of the key aspects of the Jewish experience in medieval Spain and reconsider some of the more idealized or romanticized images of their society, both past and present. So how did Spain become such a focal point of Jewish history? Well, during the 19th century, and not in Spain, but in Central Europe, European states were debating whether or not they should grant Jewish residents full citizenship rights alongside their Christian neighbors. There was much debate over whether or not Jews were even capable of being good citizens in a modern German or modern French state. And were they going to be able to contribute to non-Jewish society, or were they just a group that's concerned with their own world and their own issues? So to modern Jewish intellectuals, medieval Sephardic Jewry provided a model of how to successfully integrate Jews into a host society without sacrificing their religious identity. And this was very much on the minds of modern Jews, that the question was, can you modernize without assimilating? Can you prove to your neighbors that you're a good citizen? The first debates were in Germany, but they continued. Can you be a good American Jew, good citizen of America, involved in the life of the country, but also maintaining your connection to a Jewish history and a Jewish community? For the German Jewish rabbis and German Jewish intellectuals of the 19th century, they saw the great rabbis and merchants of medieval Spain as a perfect example of what they were trying to achieve. And so it was they who really put Spanish Jewish history on the map. They were the ones who started the field of Jewish studies in the 19th century. And it really, for them, began not so much with Second Temple Judaism or ancient Israel, but they really focused on Jewish life in medieval Spain, where you could learn the philosophy of Aristotle and literary Arabic alongside your non-Jewish neighbors, while still writing in Hebrew, composing works of Torah commentary, of Talmud as well. And by the time that Jewish nostalgia for Spain was gaining popularity in the 19th century, it already had, as I said, something of a history, certainly among the Sephardim themselves. Many Sephardic Jews who descended from the exiles of 1492 continue to speak a form of medieval Spanish in their new homes in North Africa, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire. This language, which is alternately known as Judesmo, Ladino, or Español de Nosotros, which is to say our Spanish, was sort of a living reminder of how much they missed and would like to get back to this sort of fable society of the Middle Ages. Many of these Jews still sang songs of longing for Spain. They named their synagogues after places in Spain and Portugal, and proudly, and maybe even obnoxiously at times, reminded other Jews in the world that they were Sephardim. They had their roots in the greatest of all diaspora communities. So for Jews looking for evidence of Jewish success, for cultural heroes to be proud of without isolating themselves from their neighbors, no place quite fit the bill like medieval Spain. Indeed, even in the modern world, schools and medical centers in the US, as well as streets in Israel, bear the names of some of the Spanish luminaries like Maimonides, Solomon ibn Gabirol, Judah Halevi. What was once the prized cultural patrimony of the Sephardim has now been really embraced by Jews throughout the world, Jews of Ashkenazi or Greek or other ancestries. Nor are the Jews the only ones with a strong sense of nostalgia for medieval Sepharad. In contemporary Spain, that is to say, contemporary, mostly Christian Spain, medieval Jews play a huge role in debates over the country's history and national identity. The Jews of medieval Spain formed in many ways the largest and most culturally significant community of all the Middle Ages, or at least of medieval Europe, going back to the Roman period. So if you're looking for reasons to highlight, either as a Spaniard or as a Jew, this period, you can look at Maimonides and his great law code, the Mishnah Torah, which influenced almost all halakha that came after it. His philosophical magnum opus, The Guide for the Perplexed, which in many ways influenced not only Jewish but non-Jewish philosophers. Similarly, the single most important work of Jewish mysticism, the Zohar, was written in Spain in the Middle Ages. So you have examples of these great grandees in the intellectual world, but also in the political world. A great poet and Talmudist himself, Samuel ibn Negrella, or Shmuel Hanagid, as he's often known, held the position of vizier or prime minister of a Muslim state, the city-state of Granada. He led a predominantly Muslim army out into battle. There are very few places where in Jewish history where you can see this. And the power and influence of Jewish courtiers in Christian Spain, from Hasdai Crescus in the Crown of Aragon to Isaac Abravanel in Castile was unparalleled in medieval Europe. So there's a reason why my colleagues and my teachers wrote on Jewish Spain as a golden age. It was and it wasn't. While the achievements of these great historical figures are undeniable, still, we miss something when we divide our history into golden ages and dark ages. First of all, as many of you probably know, history is rarely that simple. For example, such an approach misses the basic fact that not only were these great men exceptions and not the rule, but in many cases, what was good for the Jewish courtier or wealthy merchants was usually not good for other Jews, something I'll talk about in a minute. Moreover, my idea of a Jewish golden age and your idea of what might be an example of a great Jewish society may be very different. How modern people remember the Jews of Spain or the Jews of any time and place is unavoidably colored by what we want them to be, what we need them to be as far as cultural heroes. Sephardic Jews in Spain in the Middle Ages was not just a place that exists in our historical memory. There were actually living and breathing people who lived there. And tonight I want to get a little bit into their actual history. I noted earlier that in Spain today, the history and legacy of medieval Jews is a hot topic that might seem odd to some people. I want you to think about the debates in the United States over the legacy of the Civil War and the Confederacy, whether we should rename certain streets or towns, remove statues from public squares, etc. There are similar debates that are taking place in Spain right now over their medieval legacy, even though it's much, much older than our Civil War. This includes the legacy of the once great Jewish community there. There really is no country in the world that looks at its medieval community and its medieval heritage and its relationship to the Jewish people as much as Spain does. It's part of stump speeches for campaigns. They talk about the way Spain treated our Jews, depending on where you are on the political spectrum, that is used as a way of saying, mea culpa, we should be more inclusive, or we brought the Jews into real Spain through conversion, and we should never forget that Spain is an essentially Catholic country. These are some of the ways in which Jews are used in current political discourse in 21st century Spain. Now, celebrating Jewish contributions to Spanish civilization, for many of us, sounds like a good thing. I think today, many of us would be very happy to be celebrated for Jewish contributions rather than other things. But when tour guides in Spain today wax nostalgic about Jewish-Christian convivencia, or harmonious coexistence, as that term means, they usually fail to discuss some important facts. For instance, Jews never really came back to Spain. Today, there are about 15,000 Jews who permanently live in Spain out of a population of some 47 million. Moreover, by many Spaniards today, if you read current polls, Jews are still synonymous with greed, with moneylenders, or on the other end of the spectrum, as exotic people or pious people. You can see this not only in political polls, but at any number of cultural festivals held throughout Spain, in popular novels, TV shows, movies, and as a focal point of Spain's massive tourist industry. Medieval Jews are really everywhere. But these Jews are really two-dimensional figures that serve a larger narrative of Spanish history. They continue to function as props in the story of national identity. They're either hapless victims of the people we don't want in power, or they're clever rabbis that we sort of claim as our own to show how inclusive Spain has been in the past. Rarely, however, are they fully realized human beings. Rarely is the complex history of Jewish life ever studied on its own merits. And almost never are these Jews considered actual Spaniards, but Jews living amongst Spaniards. I want to talk a little bit about this last aspect here, about heritage tourism. For many years, I've taken tours of American Jews and Americans who are non-Jewish to Spain as part of university tours, museums like this one, synagogue tours. And it's striking to me, at least from an anthropological point of view, how the tourist industry makes so much of the Jewish remnants of medieval Spain, while maintaining their distance from actually Jewish people. So there are plaques in almost every community where any Jew ever slept or passed through, extolling the multi-religious heritage of that community, of the Juderias, or the Jewish quarters. Many of these Jewish quarters, by the time of the expulsion, had been turned into proto-ghettos. The ghetto doesn't exist yet, but areas in which Jews were forced to live and excluded from the rest of the community. So to be used really as tourism's notion of, look how inclusive Spain has been in the Middle Ages, unlike the rest of Europe, Spain was so inclusive. For those of us who know what actually went on in some of those Juderias, it's somewhat of a striking lesson that's being taught there. Local officials and tour guides alike tend to treat the modern recasting of medieval Juderias as a uniformly positive representation of both Jewish and Spanish heritage. In fact, a scholarly article promoting Jewish heritage tourism recently noted that the 240 towns and cities that make up Spain's Juderias network trumpeted the successful, quote, transformation of Jewish heritage into a unique and successful tourism product. That was written without irony. So the idea of either the exotic Jew, the happy Jew, the sad, mournful Jew, the Jew who was once our neighbor who has now moved on, is used in many ways to bring in the tourists in Spain. And problematic representations of medieval Jews are on display in other areas as well. In cultural festivals, like one in the small town of Hervás, have many Jewish visitors from Israel and the United States somewhat aghast at the way Jews are remembered in contemporary Spain. Since 1992, which was the 500th anniversary of the expulsion, this town of Hervás in the western province of Extremadura has hosted a festival known as Los Conversos, meant to celebrate the Jewish past of the region. Now, conversos is the term used for the converts, I would say forced converts of Jews to Catholicism towards the end of the Middle Ages. So naming your Jewish festival Los Conversos is already somewhat striking to professing Jews today. But even more interesting is that popular discomfort with some of the themes of Hispano-Christian history with regard to Jews and conversos forced many of the people who put on this festival to do some counter-programming that led to staging of original plays that recast the history of Jewish life in the era in a way that showed that, well, Christians weren't really anti-Semitic. And if they were anti-Semitic, well, Jews really are the stereotypes of the greedy moneylender that we always knew them to be. And so if the Jews didn't embrace conversion, it showed that their love of money was greater than their love of religion, and therefore they're the architects of their own fate. This absolves real Spaniards from any wrongdoing. Spaniards tried to be inclusive. The Jews failed to play along, and that's why the expulsion happened. And this is, again, this isn't in a mandatory school book. This isn't a festival that didn't need to happen. These people wanted to put on a festival to celebrate their Jewish past, and in the end put on a very different kind of festival. And these examples can be multiplied throughout Spanish culture today. Another is on television, a hit TV series known as Isabel, which chronicled the life of Queen Isabella I, the queen who, along with her husband Fernando, were responsible for expelling the Jews. It included several depictions of medieval Jews as pitiable victims of the Inquisition and religious zeal. Now, this trope of the suffering Jew becomes the centerpiece of other works. The best-selling author Ildefonso Falcones came up with a book which later made into a Netflix miniseries called Heirs to the Land, which is a lavishly and beautifully done miniseries about the Jewish community of medieval Barcelona. But again, you'd be hard-pressed to find normal Jewish life in any of these depictions. And finally, the same would go for more government and private organizational driven attempts to keep alive Jewish heritage in Spain through museums. You have some of these museums to the Jewish heritage, like there's a very well-known one in Girona, trying their best to keep alive the heritage of the Sephardim, but with varying degrees of success. If you go there, you will see Torah scrolls from 19th century Germany that look nothing like the sorts of Torah scrolls that were kept in the Middle Ages in Spain. You would see other articles of Jewish life that clearly come from Poland or from the Ashkenazi world of the 19th and 20th centuries, none of them really representing the Jewish life that took place in their country. So all this begs a question. With all this either legendary, nostalgic, at times anti-Semitic representations of Jewish life in medieval Spain, how should we think about this fabled society? So in my book, I have approached Jewish history, I would say, from the inside out. That is to say, to look at Jewish life the way Jews experienced it, rather than by tracing Muslim or Christian treatment or attitudes towards Jews. This latter view has dominated discussions of Jewish life in Spain for quite some time now. And while it can illuminate certain aspects of Jewish-Christian and Jewish-Muslim relations, you really pull focus from the Jews themselves. But when we look at Sephardic history from the Jewish point of view, we discover some things that many other historians have missed. And I want to give tonight 5 key points worth noting. There's a more narrative discussion of this from beginning to end in my book, but I want to pull sort of 5 key takeaways that I think might reorient the way we think about Jewish life in medieval Spain and maybe Jewish life in other eras, such as our own. And the first is, it's really hard to generalize about the Jewish experience. Within the Jewish community, there were divisions just as there were within the medieval Muslim or Christian communities. And because of this, as I mentioned earlier, what was good for one sector of society was often not good for another sector of society. Those wealthy and well-connected Jews who we often extol as the great examples of the Golden Age often used their connection to powerful Muslim or Christian lords to enhance their power over the local Jewish community in which they lived, and to dominate other Jewish rivals. So instead of saying, look, Jews too had great and powerful people, we might step back and say, and what was the relationship of those great and powerful people to the non-powerful Jews? It was often not great. In response, Jews of lower ranks often demonized their leaders as unfit, impious, and tyrannical. Tensions and violence among Jews of the same social class was no less common than tensions between Jews of different classes. Jews regularly denounced others to Christian officials. They hired Christian thugs to beat up or intimidate their business rivals, their intellectual rivals, or family members who wouldn't do what they wanted, or simply attack each other directly without using Christian intermediaries. If anything, most violence that Jews experienced in daily life was from other Jews, just as most Christians were more likely to be attacked by other Christians than they were by Jews or Muslims. And even beyond outright violence, there existed deep divisions within Jewish society between various factions that openly condemned others for misrepresenting the Jewish tradition, or at least as they saw it. So Jewish poets, Jewish mystics, Talmudists, and philosophers constantly complained about one another and about the way that each group was understanding or misunderstanding Judaism. One of the few points upon which all agreed was that Jewish society was in desperate need of reform. Things were going to heck in a handbasket, and none of this was because of Christian or Muslim anti-Semitism or mistreatment. what occupied most people's minds was their own community and the way in which they sought to influence that community to behave or to reflect their own ideals. Secondly, to the extent that we can generalize about the Jews of Spain, we can say this: most Jews were poor and led relatively unremarkable lives. That's not to take the shine off of the Abravanels or the Maimonides out there. These are true, fascinating figures who made important changes to not only Jewish, but to world history. But there's a truism that can be applied to most people in most historical eras, and that is most of them led rather unremarkable lives. In many ways, rather than saying Jews contributed to their societies because they were friends with Muslims and Christians and read philosophy together, we could say Jews were like their Muslim and Christian counterparts because they too lived on the edge of poverty, were concerned by keeping their families together, and distrusted most of their leaders. It also pushes back on some popular anti-Semitic images of Jews as moneylenders and wealthy controllers of Christian and Muslim lords. And we'll talk about more on that in a moment. Some Jews, of course, did compose wonderful works of poetry and philosophy and biblical commentary, and many did turn to money lending, especially in the later Middle Ages, as they were pushed out of other professions. But the primary Jewish occupation in medieval Spain, as in other parts of the medieval world, was that of artisan. Often, Jews were associated with the clothing trades as weavers, dyers, tanners, or leather workers. They were also involved heavily in metalwork, including as goldsmiths and silversmiths. And most of these artisans and the small-scale merchants who peddled their wares from one village to another lived on the edge of poverty. It was poverty, it was starvation, it was dealing with the ups and downs of history that most Jews were concerned with, much more than their treatment by Muslim or Christian lords, which, although from time to time erupted in violence, for most days of most weeks in most years were fairly predictable and not their primary concern. Outstanding accomplishments of the great men and women of the past are just more interesting to us than the humdrum lives of average people, and that's understandable. And perhaps more so than other modern Jews have a need to take pride in their history when there are so many efforts to criticize and dismiss it. But it's important for Jews also to bear in mind that just because we find it fascinating and we feel better about ourselves knowing that there were great moments of Jewish history, that doesn't necessarily lead us to understand the way the majority of our Jewish ancestors lived. A third key point that I like to have as a takeaway here is that just as focus on Jewish grandees is a bit misleading, so too is the modern fascination with more negative stereotypes. And in particular, I want to get back to this point of moneylending. Jews, certainly in modern Spanish society, but also if anyone takes a class on the Middle Ages in any university in the United States, the chances are when Jews come up, other than being hapless victims of crusaders or of other mobs, they're often seen as moneylenders, in part because that was the most important role they played in Christian society. So again, if you look at Jewish society from a Christian point of view, most of the time I contact with my Jewish neighbors, it's through them lending me money. However, only a small number of wealthy and powerful Jews were moneylenders at any large level. Many Jews, as I said, were artisans and not moneylenders, and those who were moneylenders were involved in petty short-term loans to Christian peasants who often had to default on those loans. So when we understand Jews as moneylenders, it might have been the most noticeable profession from the Christian point of view. It wasn't the number one profession for Jews. And even those Jews who were involved in a rather humble way. Moreover, being indebted to Jews was something that made Christians feel socially and spiritually inferior, only making matters worse. Jews were not supposed to be the people who had any power or control over Christians in a Christian society. And so the fact that you not only couldn't pay back your loan, but you might have to default on your loan and give your pledge, your land, maybe your clothing, maybe a farm animal to your Jewish lender, did not do a whole lot for Jewish-Christian convivencia, let's just say. Moreover, by the later Middle Ages, as more and more Jews are pushed into money lending, the Christian church began to fulminate against the Jews, denouncing them as getting into money lending, not because Christians in their guilds refuse to have Jews participate in other areas of society. So more artisans are pushed out of shoemaking and tailors as laws are passed saying that everyone in this town has to be a Christian in order to be part of the tailor guild or the shoemaker guild. But that the church denounces the Jews and their involvement in money lending as a plot to enslave Christians through debt. This is something that really begins in the Middle Ages, that gets repeated throughout the modern world. It gets involved in the sort of protocols of the elders of Zion, and it's an anti-Semitic trope we're still dealing with today. So Jews were involved in money lending, although generally at a small scale. It's really the Christian view of that money lending and what it represented that has stayed with us more than the experience of Jews in the Middle Ages. A fourth point to consider here is about the nature of Jewish communities, and that is this. Jewish communities, for all the fame of Spain, were actually quite small. Even larger settlements, such as the biggest Jewish communities in cities like Toledo or Burgos, rarely were larger than 350 families, and only a few cities were that big. The total Jewish population in the Kingdom of Castile in the Middle Ages at its height was probably no more than 4,000 families, and around 2 to 5% of the total population of that kingdom. So while modern Spanish efforts to be inclusive and to look back at their past and say, we had Muslims here, we had Jews here, we weren't only a Catholic country. And again, there's a political movement to either support or reject that claim. It tends us to get us to think, oh, there was a third of the country was Jews, and a third of the country was Christians, and a third of the country was Muslims, when in fact, the Jews were always a very small portion of the population living in fairly small communities. In the Crown of Aragon, the other larger kingdom in Spain, the major cities of Saragossa, Barcelona, and Valencia rarely had more than 200 or 250 Jewish families in them, which means a significant number of Jews lived in much smaller settlements scattered throughout Spain in small towns and villages. This has some meaning for us, perhaps not so much in Jewish-Christian relations, but in Jewish life. Jews who lived in these very small groups of 5 or 6 families very often lived for long periods of time without a designated synagogue, without a Jewish cemetery, without schools, without kosher butchers, etc. This doesn't mean that they saw themselves as less religious. They saw themselves as Jews, and they saw that living what they would consider a halakhic life was the ideal goal. But they had to make do very often with not fulfilling the Jewish dictates that they wanted to, because either fear of life in larger towns or economic opportunities drove them into these smaller communities. And even in the larger communities, being observant did not usually mean being highly educated. Complaints that Jews, or at least the average Jews, didn't know Hebrew well, that they had little interest in studying Talmud, that their understanding of Judaism was sorely lacking, form a constant refrain in the writings of medieval Jewish intellectuals. So one could write a whole book like the one I wrote, just from the point of view of exacerbated rabbis who think that they're the only Jews left who know anything, and that the vast majority of the Jews in their community are irreligious morons. Again, I don't think that those people saw themselves that way, but many of their intellectual leaders did see them that way. Finally, for those who have ever been to Spain, you know that Spain preserves some of the oldest and loveliest synagogues in Europe, However, you also know that they are more like jewel boxes than these great monuments to a golden age. They are dwarfed by local medieval cathedrals. A reminder, once again, of the great disparity in size, wealth, and power between Jewish and non-Jewish communities. The same goes with the great mosque of Cordoba, for instance, the religious monumental architecture of the Muslim and Christian world in Spain is so much greater than that of the Jewish world. And in many ways, that's an accurate representation of the power dynamic that existed even during this golden age. And the fifth, and I think final point I want to bring up here, and then as we finish, we can open up for questions, is about the expulsion of 1492 itself. I've written in other works about the expulsion and how much of a tragedy it was. But if we look at the expulsion, not just from the point of view of moderns that see the end of an era, but on how Jews responded and reacted to it, we realize once again, this was not a group that spoke with one voice. The Jews were expelled for a variety of reasons, but perhaps the most significant one, the one listed in the expulsion charter, was the relationship to the conversos, the so-called new Christians, who were the descendants of Jews who had been forced to embrace Christianity during a wave of riots in the summer of 1391. So between 1391 and 1492, a huge portion of the Jewish community in Spain is converted to Catholicism, and the so-called old Christians don't really trust that these Jewish converts are going to be good Christians. One of the arguments to preserve the converso ability to really blend in is that we have to get rid of their Jewish neighbors. They're going to be learning from these Jews. They're going to be getting matzah on the sly from these Jews. We have to expel these Jews to give the conversos a chance to fully integrate into Catholic Spain. But Jewish reactions to it are more complicated than that. Some Jews looked at the converts and looked at them as religiously weak. I suffered during those riots. I never accepted baptism. You should have died. You should have fled. You should have fought back, said many of the surviving Jews. Others took a different approach. It said, I was there during the riots. My wife was forcibly converted. My cousins, my children. How can I write them off? How can I say that they were not pious enough? They may be Christian according to Christian law. I refuse to sever ties with them. I will do my best to raise them as Jews, to get them prayer books or kosher food, to keep the Jewish spark alive among the conversos. And so too among some of the Jewish leaders. The idea in halakhic tradition is that if you're a forced convert, you're not a real convert. You are still a Jew. This comes from a Talmudic precedent. But it's hard for even some of those rabbis at the time to fully believe that. After the riots of 1391, there was a lot of goodwill towards the victims. But by 100 years later, by the time of the expulsion, as the Jews got ready to leave their ancestral land and leave all of their wealth behind and all of their homes and leave their cemeteries with their ancestors behind, it seemed to many, including many rabbis, that those conversos who stayed behind were taking it easy. They weren't going into exile. They were perhaps happily accommodating to their status as Christians. And so the Jewish world is broken apart by this. Family ties, personal misfortunes, petty jealousies, all determined how Jews thought about their former co-religionists as much as the pronouncements of their rabbinic leaders. And even as some of the rabbis said, look, we have a Jewish tradition. These are anusim. These are forced converts. They're still Jews. To many Jews, they said, they're fourth generation Christians at this point. None of them have been circumcised. They don't eat kosher food anymore. How am I supposed to keep considering themselves Jews? This can't be okay. And if some of those conversos, as did happen, managed to escape in the 1490s and the early 16th century, and find themselves in Italy, find themselves in the Ottoman Empire, looking to return to Judaism. Some of them are seen as prodigal sons, who risked everything to revert to Judaism openly and were seen as heroes. Others saw them as tainted, used goods. I'm sorry, but you lived as a Christian for 40 years or for 3 generations. You're not joining my synagogue. I don't care what my rabbi says. And so, just as they had for hundreds of years before their expulsion, during and after the expulsion, Jews of Spain proved that it's very easy for us to see them in a particular light as heroes or as villains, if you're from the Spanish side of things, or as hapless victims. But the truth is they reacted in a variety of ways that defy easy generalization, just as Jews of any era, I would argue, just as any large community of any era would defy easy compartmentalization. So if we were able to travel back in time to Toledo or Burgos, what would we see? I think we would see small communities where everyone knew each other, but where internal tensions and rivalries ran high, perhaps because everyone knew each other quite well. We would see Jews for whom Judaism was a defining characteristic in their lives, even as they condemned each other for not knowing enough Hebrew or halakha, or being too mystical or too prone to non-Jewish philosophy. We would see a community of a few very wealthy Jews and a much larger number of Jews who lived either at the edge of poverty or in poverty for generations. And finally, I think we would notice that they spoke like, dressed like, and lived next to and had a close relationship with their Muslim and Christian neighbors, many of whom, at least for their last century in Spain, were themselves former Jews. So perhaps in these details, we can find not so much a golden age as a window onto a world that perhaps looks much like our own. Thank you very much. We can now have Sydney open things up to some questions.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that really excellent presentation. Before we move into questions, I just wanted to thank you for that. So I know there's a lot of talking, so I'll try to give you a little bit of a break. But for those of you who are joining us, feel free to continue putting questions in the Zoom Q&A box as well. So can you, to start, I'm wondering if you can tell us, because you talked a little bit about how you kind of took a new approach to the history for this by kind of looking at it more from the Jews' point of view rather than how they were viewed by Muslims and Christians. Can you talk a little bit about your research process for the book and how you kind of...
Yeah, sure. So I don't want to say I'm the first to do this. That's not the case. But what we've had in the last several decades, since I've been in the business, is a variety of really good local studies, both by Spaniards and Americans and Israelis and Brits and others, who will look at Jewish life in this town in these decades, often focusing on Jewish-Christian relations or Jewish-Muslim relations. One of the things I would do is I would get into those studies and say, how would this life in this town look like if I looked at those same documents that the author is looking at, but bracketed the relationship with Christians? Not that that relationship isn't unimportant, but just if I started bracketing that. If I was trying to tease out, how would Jews have acted in the aftermath of a riot? Very often we get very taken by the riot and the dead and the destruction. Okay, but there's got to be a day after, a week after, then what? Your options are not that great, right? I tell this to my students. Some of my students would say, I would have left. And I said, that's a very natural response. Where would you go? There aren't a whole lot of places in the medieval world with welcome Jews signs, as perhaps there aren't in the modern era either. So other than looking at some of the traditional archival sources, these are Christian sources that look at Jewish customs records, look at Jewish and Christian legal records. There's also responsa literature, which is things that Jews would write to their rabbi. Rabbi, what do you think of this situation? So I would look at some of the responsive collections, some of them that have been written on before, but trying to take a look at this by stepping back and saying, okay, if we reread all of this stuff with a slightly different eye or with a consistently internal eye, how would that change our view of the narrative?
Thank you. So another question that came in is, I think it's more of a clarifying question, but were Jews prominent in Muslim Spain when Spain was under Muslim rule? And if so, what were those relations like?
Yeah, again, so to go back to my theme, there were a variety of them. So yes, so there are Jews who are living in Spain from the Roman period as the Germanic tribes known as the Goths come in and adopt Catholicism. There are Jews who continue to live under the Gothic order, although there are some forced conversions there as well. When large numbers of Muslim armies and immigrants start coming in the early 8th century, the Jews are already there, but there are also Jews from Iraq, from the Near East, who follow them. This becomes, as Spain becomes more Arabized, Arabic-speaking Jews see it as a place to settle as well. And they had the positions they had much as they did in Iraq or North Africa as petty artisans, petty traders, some spice merchants, some great rabbis, right? There certainly is a pyramid, but the bottom, the base of that pyramid tends to be people who are dyeing and tanning and doing other jobs that, quite frankly, were seen as dirty that Muslims shouldn't have to do. They did have good relations and bad relations with their Muslim neighbors, depending on when and where we're talking about.
Thank you. So another question that came in is asking, why did Jews not return to Spain? Do you have maybe any idea of why Jews haven't returned to Spain in large amounts since the expulsion?
Right. So that's another book and a whole nother talk. I'll give you a very, very brief answer. Most of Europe, after these countries expelled their Jews, and Spain in many ways is the capstone of medieval expulsions. England begins in 1290, and then one country after another begins to expel their Jews, with a couple important exceptions. That's Eastern Europe. So Jews begin to drift into Eastern Europe, into the lands that many American Jews will eventually come from: Poland, Russia, Lithuania, Ukraine. And Jews don't return to many of these places in large numbers openly and easily until, in the modern world, there's some sort of law that allows them to settle as citizens. Spain goes back and forth on this in the 19th century, and then for a very long period in the 20th century under Francisco Franco, it becomes very difficult to be in Spain if you're not a professing Catholic. Franco has a very fascinating love-hate relationship with the Jews and Judaism. I would say more on the hate side than the love, but a fascinating relationship nonetheless. Since 75, since Spain opens up into a more modern democratic country, there have been efforts made to not only allow Jews to resettle, but to formally extend an olive branch to former Sephardim to resettle. And there have been laws that have been passed and then sort of more recently retracted as far as letting Jews come back. I think it's a larger question why Jews choose not to, in the last few decades, take advantage of some of these opportunities. The short answer would be that places like Israel, the United States, and other places have offered a more attractive place to settle for Jews than Spain has. That might change. We'll see.
Thank you. So I'm going to combine a couple of questions into one that have come in, but if someone wants to learn more about a specific town and the Jewish population there in Spain, both throughout the eras, perhaps, what resources do you recommend, and how do you recommend they go about doing that?
Yeah, it's very hard. There's not a lot of census data like this. I'll say this. They're gone in 1492, and they're not back until the 1960s. And since the 1960s, they're in two towns. They're in Barcelona and Madrid. There's 3,000 to 5,000 Jews living in Barcelona today. There's about 10 living in Madrid. that's kind of it. There may be a handful of Jews who technically have residence in other cities. Those are the two towns. So in the past 500 years, there's been two towns, and it's really since the 1960s. So you're really talking about the medieval world. And I mean, other than going through the index of my book and going through some other sort of scholarly literature, it's a bit of a detective work.
Thank you. And this kind of connects. Do you know what city had the highest population of Jews before the expulsion?
So, as I said, the time of the expulsion, the Jews are sort of a broken community, right? They're attacked and severely damaged in 1391. In 1391, a century before the expulsion, Burgos, Toledo, Barcelona, Saragossa, and Valencia were the largest. And these are sort of the regional capitals of Spain. They are the largest Jewish populations. Barcelona disappears in 1391. Valencia is severely damaged at that time. Burgos and Toledo hang on a little bit, but many of these mid-sized cities, they just scatter into the countryside. So that last century sees a huge dispersion of Jews into populations of, handfuls of families at a time. So we talk about the largest, that ends in 1391, and the five cities I've just mentioned.
Thank you. So another question that came in, I'm going to ask this. If you don't know the answer, no worries, but I did want to ask, what role did Portugal play in the expulsion of the Sephardic Jews?
So no direct role in the decision to expel, right? Fascinating why we don't know 1391 took the path that it did, but the Portuguese Jews are not attacked. It went throughout much of the Iberian Peninsula. It missed certain regions. Mm-hmm. Portugal, there were not major attacks in 1391 the way there are. There are attacks before and after that date. But one of the roles that Portugal plays is, if you look at a map at the Iberian Peninsula, those Jews living in Castile in the western half of the peninsula fled to Portugal. Those who were in the eastern side of the peninsula in the Crown of Aragon went to ports in the Mediterranean and sailed usually on Italian ships to North Africa and Italy. So the easiest thing you could do in Spain was to walk, and most people did have to walk to Portugal and enter there. This infuriated Ferdinand and Isabella. They were not looking to have the Jews just step over the border and possibly leak back in over time. Mm-hmm. So they write to the King of Portugal and they say, you got to expel them from Portugal too. The king doesn't want to expel them from Portugal. He has Jews living there in addition with the Jews who just came from Spain. These are tax-paying citizens. These are people who, the king benefits from. He doesn't want to be told what to do by the king and queen of Spain. Eventually, through diplomatic pressure, he comes up with a decision I'm going to forcibly convert all of them. That way I can have my cake and eat it too, so to speak. So in 1497, through a variety of means, the Jews of Portugal, both the ones who had always lived there and the Spanish refugees, are uniformly converted to Catholicism. Unfortunately, the same cycle happens as it happened in Spain. They're not accepted by the other Catholics. Mm-hmm. And the Portuguese Inquisition is brought in a few decades later. So in many ways, Portugal becomes Spanish tragedy part 2. And many of the cycle that happened at the end of the Middle Ages in Spain repeats itself in Portugal.
Thank you. So another question that came in, were Jews in different medieval, countries or areas, were the Jews in Spain communicating outside of their own communities? Were they in contact with any Ashkenazi communities or anything like that, or was it mostly insular?
No, absolutely. And this is, I think, what those German intellectuals loved. The Spanish Jews saw themselves as not only the best of the diaspora, but that as leaders of the diaspora. And in many ways, we have people we can know by their names. They come from all over the world to study in Toledo, to study in Barcelona, to study among some of these great rabbis. Some of the great rabbis, Nachmanides very famously, goes up into France to study. So that there's acknowledgement that some of the great scholars of northern France and of Germany also are worth visiting. There are trade routes that run from eastern Spain, the Spanish March, up into Provence, and from there up into the Rhone and Rhine valleys. And Italy. So the southern half of Italy is conquered by the Crown of Aragon at a time, and so you have a connection between the Jews in the Crown of Aragon, the Jews in southern Italy as well. But really, as far afield as Egypt and Yemen and the Byzantine Empire, later the Ottoman Empire, there are people who are reading the works of the Jews of Spain and aware of what's going on there. So it's a quite an interesting and connected world. They sometimes don't get along, but there's an awareness, and there are certainly trade and intellectual networks that exist throughout the medieval world among all these different groups. I can't think of one that is truly isolationist at this time.
Thank you. And so I know we are coming to the end of our time, so I think we have time for about one or two more questions. But do you have any recommendations besides your own book, of course, of other primary and secondary sources that people can reference if they want to learn more about this period?
So sure, I'll give a couple things. I think, you know, there are great novels about this period. Journey to the End of Millennium is one. Anything you look up on Amazon that you can see a popular book on the Jews of Spain, certainly if it's by a Jewish author, you have some, you know, some possibility of getting some historical accuracy there from the Jewish point of view. You know, my friend and mentor Benji Gampel has a beautiful book out on the riots of 1391 and the way they changed Spain. So if you look up Benjamin R. Gampel's work, I think that's one I would recommend. A lot of stuff, unfortunately, is in Spanish, some of it in Hebrew. When it comes to primary sources, there are definitely works out there. J.R. Marcus has a book called The Jew in the Middle Ages, which is a set of primary sources, some of them coming from Spain. And the Posen Library of Jewish Civilization is coming out with different volumes of amazing large volumes of primary sources. Volume 3, which is the Muslim part of Spain, will be out hopefully sometime in 2024. And then Volume 4, which will be about the second half of Jewish life in Spain, the 1200 to 1500 period, will be out 2025, hopefully. So those are examples. You can look for the Posen Library as a great series, which has an amazing amount of sources.
Amazing. And so for our last question, we have a lot of people who are wondering where they can learn more about your work and sort of what you're up to.
So you can look at me. I'm fairly easy to find at Georgetown University. You have my works there. I also have a private website, which is linked to the one at Georgetown University, and either one of those. There is a Jonathan Ray that spells his name exactly like I do, who writes on wine. I am jealous that he is living the life I was meant to live. So by all means, look up his work as well. But the Jonathan Ray who doesn't write on wine, who does write on Jewish history, I think you can find me fairly easily through Georgetown.
That's great. And yeah, I think we all have our doppelganger out there living
Yes,
our true life.
our true lives.
But thank you so much, Jonathan, for the really excellent presentation and for answering all of these questions. I apologize that we didn't get to your question, to all of you out there. We had a lot coming in, but thank you so much for being so engaged with us as well. So if you, I highly encourage you to purchase Jewish Life in Medieval Spain, which you can do at the link in the chat if you want to learn more about what we talked about today. If you enjoyed today's program, we also hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mghnyc.org/support.